This is Caleb Barney with Russell Real Estate, and today we are going to go over the lead-based paint disclosure statement. So this statement is actually just a one-page document, and we're going to go through it all, but essentially it is required for any property, any residential property that's being bought, sold, or leased that was built prior to 1978. So with this, you're actually going to have at the top of the form the property address of whatever property is in question, and then you'll have your lead warning statement. So basically what it says is every purchaser of any interest in residential real property on which a residential dwelling was built prior to 1978 is notified that such property may present exposure to lead from lead-based paint that may place young children at risk of developing lead poisoning. Lead poisoning in young children may produce permanent neurological damage, including learning disabilities, reduced IQ, behavioral problems, and impaired memory. Lead poisoning also poses a particular risk to pregnant women. The seller of any interest in residential real property is required to provide the buyer with any information on lead-based paint hazards from risk assessments or inspections in the seller's possession, and notify the buyer of any known lead-based paint hazards. A risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint hazards is recommended prior to purchase. So this form right here, you'll actually see as both the buyer, the seller, and the renter, if that's needed. But basically, the seller will fill out this first portion, which includes two sections. So section 1, the seller is saying they either do know of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards present in the house, or they do not know of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the house. So it's an either or. Both of these should not be checked off, but one of them should be. And keep in mind that even if the seller has no knowledge of these hazards, if the home was built prior to 1978, there is a risk of there being lead-based paint in that property. The second question for the seller's disclosure is the records and reports available. And basically the two options here is option 1, the seller has provided the buyer or purchaser with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing, or the seller has no reports or records pertaining to those items. So again, an either or. And just because the seller does not have any reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint does not mean that the property does not have lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards there. On the buyer's side, you have the purchaser's acknowledgement, and they have 3 sections to fill out. Section 1, they just initial that they've received copies of all of the information listed above. So if the seller has reports, it's just showing that, yes, we have received that. The purchaser has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. That will be provided to them by the buyer's agent, and it goes over basically the risks of lead-based paint in more detail. And then the buyer or purchaser also has an option that they would have to check either of these boxes. Option 1 is that they've received a 10-day opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. And then the other option would be that they waived that opportunity to conduct that risk assessment or inspection. For the agents, this is specifically geared toward the listing agent. The agent has informed the seller of their obligations under federal law, and is aware of his or her responsibility to ensure that the seller is complying with those. And then lastly, we have the certification of accuracy. Both parties will have to sign this as well as their agents. So the sellers will have to sign it, the buyers will have to sign it, and then the list agent and buyer's agent will have to sign it as well.